Coming up on This Week in Enterprise Tech, booth babes don't sell products, the coming X-Pocalypse, and everything you ever wanted to know about net neutrality but were afraid to ask. Twiet on the set.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for This Week in Enterprise Tech is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Twiet, This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 76, recorded January 20th, 2014. Net neutral, Padre biased. This episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech is brought to you by TechServe. TechServe assists U.S. businesses of all sizes with their technology needs, including Apple, Avid, Adobe, and HP solutions. Visit techserve.com/Twiet and receive a complimentary iPad deployment assessment. Welcome to Twiet, This Week in Enterprise Tech. It's the show dedicated to the enterprise professional, the IT pro, and the geek who just wants to know how the world is connected. I'm your host, Father Robert Ballas, your guide to all things in the enterprise. And I'm joined by my friend and fellow geek, Mr. Brian Chi, the director of the Advanced Network Computing Laboratory in Honolulu, Hawaii. Brian, welcome. You don't seem to be at your office. Where are you right now?
Hey, I am paying homage to Dr. Martin Luther King and celebrating his birthday. And so I'm at home.
Home? Wait, like on vacation?
Like, yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well,
I'm a state employee. I get lots of vacation.
All right. I guess that's
this is why I like being a state employee.
All right. Well, you know what? There is no vacation from the enterprise world, which is why we're going to kick it off with an enterprise bite. Now, Curtis Franklin can't join us today. He's on special assignment trying to find out the source of the mystical Doge. But while he's gone, Brian, you want to talk about booth babes?
Oh, of course.
You want to define what a booth babe is first?
Well, our typical explanation of what a booth babe is someone from a typically Las Vegas or so forth modeling agency that's hired just to spruce up the booth.
That's right.
They don't necessarily know anything about it. They're just trying to appeal to the male of the industry to lure them into the booth.
Yeah, I like to call this the seedy side of the internet, of the enterprise. And we all know this. If you've ever gone to a conference, any sort of professional conference, be it the Consumer Electronics Show or Interop or ShmooCon, you're going to find that vendor, that manufacturer who believes that the way to get the most traffic to his or her booth is to stock it with college-age attractive women. Well, we had an interesting little experiment that was performed by Spencer Chen, who is the head of marketing for Frontback. It's a PR group specializing in these live events. At CES 2014, he had two booths that he had to stock for one customer. So same amount of material, just in two different locations. And with the company's blessing, he decided to do a little bit of a social thing. He stocked one booth with booth babes and the other booth with, well, elderly women, not the Powerpuff Girls, but pretty dang close. What he found was that the booth babe booth got less than 1/3 of the traffic and less than 1/2 of the leads of the supposedly unattractive booth. Now, this kind of blew his colleagues away. They didn't really understand why this happened. It went against all the traditional thought that you need these attractive women to draw in the young men, the middle-aged men, the technology men who are going to make the purchases, who are going to give you these leads. But his numbers are actually pretty compelling. I'd like to see this experiment done a few more times before I write off the booth babe entirely. But Brian, does this mean something different for enterprises, for businesses who go to these shows to show off their wares?
You know, I can't speak for a lot of other enterprises, but when I was doing a lot of work with the military and especially military contracting, we would avoid the booths with the booth babes because that told us, the marketing people, didn't have a good enough product to attract us on their own merit. In fact, Wayne Rash and I were blitzing it across the Comdex trade show floor many years ago. And the only time a booth babe ever worked in their favor was when we're going past the Secor booth. We saw a really stunning platinum blonde terminating fiber optics. And we stopped going, oh my God, she's probably a PhD in optics or something. Found out she had been hired that morning and was taught how to do fiber optics. So my read on is booth babes can be effective, but use them right. Don't use them strictly as eye candy.
Yeah, I like that. Also, on a personal note, I've just kind of found them demeaning. I remember at CES 2013, the crew and I actually did some footage at a now notorious booth that involved women in nothing more than body paint. I think they were supposed to be advertising some sort of USB drive, which was ridiculous. Now, we did a video there. We didn't actually include it in our special because we couldn't figure out a really good way to do that. But it always seemed a little weird if you were going to be there because of your passion for tech, that somehow putting out eye candy would draw you in. Now, I want to get past that. Let's go on to an actual enterprise bite. And Cheebert, that's all about the coming X-Pocalypse. You've heard about this ad nauseum. We know that Microsoft is going to drop their support for Windows XP this year, April 8th. Now, they've extended their, I believe, virus warning service until April 15th, 2015. But by the same token, that's just not going to help them when actual support, official support, is going to drop out. What we're finding out is that there are so many different parts of the enterprise, so many different businesses that will just not be ready to make that transition. Here's a couple of numbers for you. As of December 2013, Windows XP market share was still 29%. That's 28.98%, just below that of Windows 7. That's a huge percentage of the Windows market out there that's running on an operating system that will very soon be out of date. Now, Cheebert, there are a few nightmare scenarios that surround this. The first was actually brought up by Tim Raines, who's the director of Microsoft's Trustworthy Computing Group. He said the very first Windows update that we get for Windows 7 or Windows Vista or Windows 8 that has a vulnerability, every hacker on the planet is going to scan that vulnerability, backwards engineer it, get the exploit out of it, and then try it against a Windows XP machine just to see if maybe it might share that same vulnerability. There are others, and I've heard this from sources, who are saying that hackers are now stockpiling their zero-day exploits. They don't want to use them now. They're going to wait until April 9th, the day after the support ends, and use them, knowing that these exploits will never be patched. In essence, we're looking at a future of Windows XP that will always have security holes, no matter how much protection you may try to erect around it. Now, working on a university campus, Cheebert, what's your view of this? Does the University of Hawaii have a way to get rid of all these vulnerable stations?
No, the university, any university, unless you have a really, really strong IT group, is never going to be able to mandate what operating system the researchers, academics, and students use. They only can offer carrots or sticks. So like, for instance, the University of Hawaii has basically said, if you're going to be running Windows XP, you're on your own. We're not going to be supporting you. We're not going to help you fix your network. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do that. You need to upgrade because it's too vulnerable and so forth. It's kind of, I equate it to a used car. Once a used car gets past a certain end of life, the manufacturer is not going to be issuing safety check. They're not going to be doing safety upgrades. They're not going to be giving you accessories. You're going to have to start fighting to get those spare parts. The same thing goes with operating systems. The operating system is past its life. The Windows XP needs to start going away. The unfortunate fact of life is that XP is embedded into an awful lot of things. XP embedded is in gas pumps. They're in ATMs. They're in airport signage. And my only shot at Microsoft is, guys, you are way, way too slow with Windows 7 embedded. And I haven't even heard really a hint about Windows 8 embedded. You're not going to get people off those really old operating systems until you give them an equivalent, and the embedded world has not caught up.
Right. Now, one of the more worrisome statistics was that 95% of the world's ATM machines are running on some form of Windows XP. I actually couldn't believe this. I checked with it to make sure that this was right, and several different reports have said, no, that's right. 95% of these machines are running some form, either Windows XP or Windows XP Embedded, which, by the way, is less vulnerable and will continue to be supported until 2016. But that's a huge number. Chibert, I want to extend off of our discussion from last week when we were talking about the PCI DSS requirements, those supposed secure objectives that allow retailers like Target and Neiman Marcus to have secure point-of-sale terminals. If we see a lot of these machines using Windows XP, shouldn't, by definition, they automatically no longer be available to be certified under PCI DSS on April 9th?
You know, I've read through the PCI DSS documentation, and I do not see any regulations stating operating systems or operating system patch, just that they be up to date and patched. So I guess you could say, well, XP, since it can no longer be patched and updated, no longer qualifies under the PCI DSS, but does it?
Right, exactly. That's what's got me worried, that somehow there's going to be a loophole. And a lot of these vendors who should be swapping out their machines, or at least have some sort of plan to swap them out, are just not going to pay attention to them. Now, I think that's enough doom and gloom. Rather than talking about all the ways that we can be hacked, how about we spend a little bit of time to talk about a supporter of the Twiat Riot who tells us how we can support our systems. And of course, that's TechServe. Now, we here on Twiat tend to be a bit PC-centric. We know it. I acknowledge that. I'm not as strong in the Apple market as I should be, which is why I am very, very happy to have TechServe as a supporter of the Twiat Riot, because they know Apple. As New York's premier authorized Apple reseller and technology provider, TechServe serves creative professionals at all levels, from individual customers to Fortune 100 companies. TechServe carries a full range of Apple products, from iPhones and iPads to iMacs, MacBooks, iPods, and accessories. TechServe also has a range of partnerships with top vendors to facilitate flexible, efficient, and creative solutions for all your business needs. TechServe assists businesses of all sizes to deploy Apple, Avid, and Adobe solutions throughout the United States. Whether you're already committed to iPads or just getting started, from sales to support, process to practice, TechServe can help. Now, some amazing technology solutions are being deployed on iPads right now. If you've been to the Delta terminals in LaGuardia, Toronto, or Minneapolis, you may have noticed that nearly every seat in the terminal is equipped with an iPad. Travelers can now sit anywhere in the terminal and receive real-time flight updates on that iPad, or use them to order food, play games, browse the internet, and check email, all while they're waiting. Over 1.5 million visitors used these iPads in Delta's terminals just this past year, and the result has been a double-digit increase in food and beverage revenue and the highest customer satisfaction scores of all participating airports. OTG Management is the hospitality company behind Delta's terminals, and they've turned to TechServe to provide, configure, and install the world's largest deployment of iPads, a number that just keeps growing as they add new terminals. And TechServe really was the natural place for them to turn, because they sell, support, personalize, configure, and manage massive iPad projects, from the Delta terminals to a school with 700 chef instructors, to an operation that delivered personally configured iPads to 3,000 cable technicians. TechServe is able to do full lifecycle management for all of your technology needs by providing the devices that you need, getting them up and running, teaching you and your staff how to effectively use them, and maintaining them so that they're working efficiently. TechServe also provides ongoing support so that if your enterprise has a problem, help is just a phone call away. So if you're considering adding iPads to your business, why not ensure your project's success with the world's most experienced partner? If your business is considering integrating iOS technology at your workplace, then contact TechServe today and receive a complimentary iPad deployment assessment. Visit techserve.com/Twiat, and TechServe will help you assess your current or future iPad needs and give you advice to make it a success. That's techserve.com/Twiat. And we thank TechServe for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Now, folks, we're going to get to a deep dive on the recent setback for the FCC and net neutrality. I want to welcome two guests to the show, both very uniquely qualified to talk about this. The first is Brandon Ross. He's the Chief Network Architect of Network Utility Force. Brandon, thank you for coming back. You are a routing expert, are you not?
I guess you could say that. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. We've worked together, actually, Chibert, I, and you, and all those different pronoun agreements, have worked together at Interop for many, many years. And you are our guru of all things routing. And you are joined by Mr. Dane Jasper, who is the CEO and co-founder of Sonic.net, an ISP, a broadband provider here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Dane, thank you for coming on. I've been wanting to get you on the show for a while, and it's wonderful that you can come and talk about this specific topic.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
All right. Now, let's give a little bit of background, because I know there's been a lot of knee-jerk reactions to this decision. Everything from the appellate court is stupid to DC is ridiculous to the FCC doesn't know what they're doing. I think it helps to have a little bit of background to this problem that we're now addressing. The sad, angry story of how the FCC bloopered net neutrality actually dates back to 1996, at least. That's when the Telecommunications Act gave the FCC the authority to regulate internet service providers as either a telecom or an information service. Now, we have to understand the difference between the two. A telecommunication service transmits data, transmits and receives, while an information service processes data. The cable industry argued way back when that since it didn't just transmit and receive data, but that it provided services like email and web pages, that it was an information service. Well, in 2002, the FCC agreed, and they classified internet service providers as an information service. This is important because an information service doesn't have the same automatic regulations under the 1996 Telecommunications Act that a telecom would. If you are classified as a telecom, you become a common carrier, which means your pipes must be available to everyone. There must be no restrictions on how the data flows. But an information service, well, that kind of lies in between. The problem is that these cable companies, the broadband providers, were both telecoms and information services, but they were only being classified by the FCC as the latter. Now, let's fast forward to just last week. The Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia came out and said, look, the FCC has no right to regulate these internet broadband providers, these internet service providers, because they had previously, in 2012, classified them as information services. Now, let's bring in our guests. I want to start with you, Dane. What are your initial thoughts about this ruling? Was it inevitable? Is it wrong? Do we now have reason to hope that maybe they might classify telcos as actually these internet service providers as telcos? What are your leanings?
Well, I think the ruling was unsurprising. The FCC of, 2 chairmanships ago really set this up. And so there were a lot of challenging decisions that were made in the early 2000s that have, to a great degree, hobbled today's FCC. So, my first reaction is it's unsurprising. It's a real threat to the internet, to innovation on the internet, to startups. That said, I'll have to confess, as a competitive service provider, we see it as an opportunity. If the entrenched duopoly players are going to behave badly, then we automatically get, by default, a bit better by not behaving badly. So I have sort of a mixed reaction to it.
Mixed reaction. I like that. I like nice and level. Let me go to someone who I also know is always nice and level. Brandon, first impressions.
Well, the network neutrality thing all along has been a mixed bag. You can imagine many services that net neutrality actually helps bring to market faster than they would have otherwise. And you can imagine many other services where the lack of net neutrality restrictions can help those move to market faster. So really, from a lot of perspectives, it's very mixed. There's both good things and bad things to requiring service providers to have net neutrality. As far as the decision itself, I think it's a little bit on the silly side from the FCC's part. Because, and I'm no legal scholar, but my understanding is it was FCC's own rules that said that they couldn't regulate things like net neutrality as an information provider. So I think someone was asleep at the wheel there a little bit when they actually wrote a lot of this legislation.
Yeah. Cheebert, let me go over to you, because we do hear a lot of that, especially in the social media services, that look, the FCC just didn't know what they were doing, that they countered themselves, that over the last 2 decades they just don't know how to deal with the internet. Is that your feeling? I mean, is this whole problem created by the fact that the FCC just doesn't know what they're doing with the internet?
No, it's more a matter of the SEC is dealing with multiple generations of rule makers. It's like any big bureaucracy. One generation makes a rule, and the next generation maybe doesn't want to touch it, or maybe they don't want to piss off their boss because they got promoted and so forth. There's a lot of this where you've got layers upon layers upon layers. The legal system is like an onion, just like Shrek. And the whole deal is, man, how do we go and change this without making ourselves look like idiots? Well, later on they look like idiots because they're counteracting themselves. I ran into a lot of this back in the 80s and 90s when we started the Coalition for Competitive Telecommunications in Hawaii, and we actually fought and went through PUC testimony to deregulate the interlata voice market in Hawaii. We actually beat the feds by a year. And we ran into an awful lot of looking at the dates of when certain acts and when certain laws were imposed, and finding out that multiple generations were counteracting each other. So it's just typically a big bureaucracy, and I feel bad for the FCC because they're looking like idiots here. But I'm sorry, you guys, you promoted people into new positions, and you haven't changed their perhaps flawed previous work.
All right. Brandon, I want to go to you first for a question about what we're hearing being called the fast lane. This is one of the things that some of the vendors have saying, well, we want to be able to provide a fast lane. Customers who are willing to pay us more, who are willing to give us a little extra money to guarantee that their packets arrive on time. How would you even do that on the internet? On an internet that is based on peering, where we've got all these different carriers that are agreeing to provide free access to their lines. Their packets can flow freely back and forth. How would you create an internet fast lane that these, say, AT&T or Verizon could sell to its customers?
So at the risk of maybe going too technical here, there's certainly quality of service features that most backbone routers and most edge routers that are in use today support, where you could effectively mark traffic coming into your network as preferred in some manner, and then if you encounter congestion throughout your network, or if you simply decide that there's a limit as to how much of that traffic you want to carry, you could limit that traffic either by rate or by availability throughout the network. So from a technical point of view, this isn't necessarily new. On enterprise networks, certainly people have been doing quality of service adjustments on their network for a long time. For example, if you have a VoIP system in your enterprise, there's a good chance that your network designers have given it higher preference to, say, web browsing, because you don't want your phone call to get interrupted while someone's downloading a big file.
Right, right. Dane, let me go over to you, because I see a lot of people in the chat room who are saying, hey, well, that's what throttling is, right? I mean, every carrier can throttle. Doesn't that create a fast lane if they throttle the traffic for all the other customers? It's not that easy when we're dealing with peering, right? I mean, right now we've got a recurring situation that happens between Level 3 and Verizon, where they're each accusing the other of not supporting the net neutral principles enough. You know, you're not giving our users enough bandwidth. You're not giving our traffic enough priority. You're not being fair in how we exchange our bits. So let's say a customer in New York is trying to have a fast lane to an office in San Francisco. That traffic might be bouncing through a dozen different networks. Do you, as a CEO, as a person who does this for a living, do you see it to be a trivial nature of them setting a couple of QoS rules and it guarantees the performance of a packet?
I think, you know, it depends upon the nature of the architecture of the network as to how simple that might be. But you could certainly disadvantage a protocol, you could disadvantage sources, and you could, for those who pay you something, you could give them closer access to your edge. So, you know, an example might be Netflix today offers service providers edge caching appliances. Service providers deploy those. Netflix today won't pay them anything. But in an environment where you had a non-neutral network, you might bring that preferred content right up to your edge and take a fee for that interconnection. And what you'll see with, you know, whether it's, you know, Verizon, Level 3 and Netflix, or Comcast, affecting Netflix or YouTube, is the connection, the pipe, whether it's your Comcast cable connection or your Verizon Fios connection, you run a speed test, it looks really fast, but then, why is your Netflix buffering or your YouTube being all blocky? And, that the answer to that is those interconnections are being disadvantaged in some way today.
Right. Schubert, I want to go over to you. When we talk about these interconnects, these peering points being disadvantaged, and we see it all the time, we hear it occasionally when we hear about the spats. Like, for example, when Level 3 starts complaining that it's too much dang Netflix traffic or too much YouTube traffic coming over their network. Is that the same thing as talking about net neutrality in terms of creating a fast lane? I mean, it is one thing to say, look, we got to throttle back on your traffic because your network is sending us too much stuff. It's another thing entirely to say, we are going to allow you to pay to get better performance than your competitors, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I'm actually running into a problem with that for some city and county lawyers right now. Level 3 is actually telling them that the pass off from their provider, which at this moment I believe is Time Warner, is being disadvantaged. That it's actually taking them an extra 200 milliseconds to get to a server in Missouri. And Level 3 is saying, well, you can pay for better connection. And that just feels wrong. And I think the city and county lawyers are sharpening their knives at Level 3 right now.
Right. Dane, let me go back to you really quickly again on a slightly different topic, and that is talking about internal competition. You mentioned this when you talk about bringing it right up to the edge of the service. So far, we've been talking about creating a fast lane on the internet so that, say, AT&T or Verizon could sell me a service that provides better performance to my customers. One thing that we haven't talked about is, well, what if a telco, what if an incumbent, what if an ISP, like, say, I don't know, Comcast, also had their own content providing network and started providing better peered service to those services over, say, Netflix or YouTube? That in essence, that's already broken net neutrality, yes?
Yeah, and that has been in practice for quite some time. And you'll see, on-demand services, IPTV services like AT&T's Uverse, where the video content that you subscribe to, the pay-per-view content, is being delivered preferentially over internet access. So, that's happening today, and it's certainly an issue.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you about that, Brandon. There are those who are saying, look, net neutrality was already dead. It was dead the minute that Verizon started slowing down traffic. It was dead the minute that Oceanic started offering their own package that didn't count against their data cap. It was dead the minute that AT&T started saying, look, if you're accessing an AT&T number, we'll let you do that without charging against your resources, but otherwise we're going to have to hit you for your data. Is this all just semantics? I mean, has this net neutral principle been dead for a while?
Well, there's no doubt that there are plenty of places in the network that would not necessarily follow a strict definition of net neutrality today, even before any of this ruling happened. So I definitely agree with you there. But I think there's a different level of magnitude that we might see without regulation. For example, while it was mentioned today, for example, that AT&T probably gives preference to their in-house video service as opposed to any kind of preference to Netflix or YouTube, that's almost certainly true. But they haven't, as far as I know, purposefully and clearly slowed down the traffic from other services. So one of the main things to think about when you think about quality of service in a network is that normally in a normal network, quality of service, preferring one traffic over the other, only comes into account when there's actually congestion in the network. So maybe at the edge of your network, your local link between yourself and your upstream provider, where you control what kind of traffic is going over that, you may see congestion there because maybe you're only paying for 5 meg or 10 meg or whatever the service you have is. But in network backbones today, for the most part, good, well-designed backbones don't have congestion. Now, you talked about the peering issue where you see congestion at the peering. That's kind of a different subject. But for the most part, our traffic is not terribly congested from end to end except at the edges. When you start moving into a model where a large cable company or a telephone company that has an interest in its own content wants to not only prefer their content, but actively disadvantage other people's content, I think it's at that point that we're trying to cross a line from simply trying to optimize things to actively being somewhat anti-competitive.
All right. Actually, I want to continue with you on that one, Brandon, because there are those people who will say, well, look, this is just a management thing, right? I mean, the telcos have constantly said, we need to be able to manage our own networks, otherwise we're going to see them collapse. I mean, they used to call this story the coming of the exo flood. There's going to be so much traffic on the net that all of our exchange points are going to blow up and melt into puddles of goo. Do you find that? I mean, it sounds like you're saying, no, that's not the case, but is that all a compelling reason to say, look, the administrator is just asking for the basic right to be able to tweak his network as he needs to maintain performance?
Yeah, so once again, there's a difference between basic management of the network and actively working to disadvantage targeted content or targeted destinations that compete with your properties or with your friends' properties. It's there's a difference between kind of an active approach and a passive approach. And I think a passive approach is somewhat tolerable. Yeah, if your peer-to-peer file sharing is impacting people who are just trying to surf the web, I could see why you might want to put a limit on that, or better yet, simply deprioritize it so that people's web traffic gets through first, or VoIP traffic, for example, is a great one. But I think when we're crossing the line there is if I go and say, I'm going to purposefully make sure that the traffic I don't like doesn't perform well so that people will choose my property instead of something that's being delivered, what we call it is over the top, when you're delivering a service just over the IP channel that's not integrated into the edge service provider's network.
Yeah. Dane, let me give that over to you because I think you can give us a unique perspective on this. Talking about disadvantaging other competitors' traffic. Now, we may not sell it that way. I'm sure no carrier is going to go, oh, by the way, if you give me X amount of money, that your competitor over here, his website might slow to a crawl. But they're going to sell it as, why don't we put you in a higher tier than your competitor, and therefore your traffic will always be guaranteed above his or her traffic. Does this sound like a sustainable business model to you? Because to me, it sounds as if with all the different arrangements you have to make with all the different carriers and all, say your colo and your common carrier and the one who carries the bits to your website and the one who carries the bits to your office, it would seem to be a never-ending arms race. You're always going to be trying to one-up your competition, and eventually it just becomes an unsustainable mess.
Well, I think, the death of neutrality means that carriers can manage their networks however they like. One thing that was upheld was disclosure requirements. But disclosure requirements aside, you can just say our network is a best effort network, and you can disadvantage protocols. So, BitTorrent could be severely disadvantaged. VoIP traffic, which competes with your $30 a month unlimited voice, could be disadvantaged. And video traffic, could be capped. And we see that today where service providers have, 150 to 300 gigabyte caps are pretty typical domestically. And that means that the video services can't replace TV. So, what this decision means is that service providers can just do what they like, run the network how they like. And for a web property, what that might mean is if the web property either needs a lot of bits, think, very high definition video or many hours of video, or they need assured latency. You think about gaming or telecommunications, video conferencing and voice over the internet. They might need to pay something to assure that their traffic was good, not 90% of the time, but 99.9% of the time. And they would need to go to AT&T, to Comcast, to Verizon, Time Warner, Charter, and the combination of those might get them 90% of the domestic destinations. And it would be challenging to manage, but you could have those relationships and interconnect directly with those entities with some assured traffic management.
Dane, I'm glad you brought that up. I want to go over to you, Brandon, and actually talk about that. That's something I alluded to at the beginning when I talked about the difficulty of creating a fast lane in such a peered architecture. Would you have to, if you wanted to guarantee service in this new neutral internet, if you wanted to guarantee service, would you have to go to AT&T and Verizon and Level 3 and all the different major carriers, and then even the smaller ones, to make sure that you're going to be able to reach all of your customers equally?
Well, so if you're talking to me from a perspective of if I'm a content provider, how would I go about creating that fast lane? Then yes, as a content provider, something like a Netflix, let's say I was providing video, yeah, I would need to go to all of the service providers that had end users that I wanted to sell my service to, and if I wanted a fast lane on all of them, I would have to negotiate them with them separately. But I think what you're going to find here, as far as the economics goes, is it's going to be less about whether particular properties go and try to manage that with the carriers, and more the other way around. Where I think you're going to see more along the lines of large carriers approaching the content providers and saying, well, you have two choices. You can, let's just stay with the service you have, and let's say it doesn't work one day. Well, what are we going to do about it? You're not paying us. You're not our customer. Why should we fix it? Or there's if you'd like to become our customer so that we pay good attention to the quality of the traffic that you're sending to your end users, you could pay us something every month for our trouble.
I've heard this before. I don't know where that came from. Tibert, let me go over to you. We've got Web 6566, I believe. Oh, yeah, 6566 in the chat room, who brought up a very interesting point in saying that, is this just an American-centric issue? I mean, does this not seem to be an issue anywhere else in the world? No one else seems to be screaming bloody murder at the end of net neutrality. Is this much ado about nothing, or is this just something from the first world problem perspective?
Actually, I think this is very American. The folks in the chat room in the UK are saying, gee, I wonder if this is going to actually affect us or not. And I'm not sure they will. And our Canadians in the chat room are saying, well, our networks are owned by a small number of people anyway, so less to complain about. But the same guy, Web 6566, says, this reminds me of the old railroad wars. And I agree with him. It is. In fact, it's very much like when you start talking about trains versus cars versus this versus that. There's a lot of people starting to talk about, gee, how are we going to make sure it's fair? And the unfortunate thing is when Congress starts stepping in, then all of a sudden you start getting a lot of goofy regulations. So my spin on this is ISPs, especially the tier 1 guys, be very careful how you tread on this, because this is leading towards, if you guys start getting stupid about this, we're going to have Ma Bell all over again. We're going to have FCC regulation, and the FCC is a messy process. If you start having the government saying this or that, how you can do business, then suddenly this or that's going to start really eating into your bottom line. My personal opinion is be reasonable about how you do free and open business, because you don't want regulated business. Trust me on this. I've been through having to sell regulated lease line modems, and the amount of paperwork and overhead and so forth was insanity.
Got it. All right, I want to switch the topic slightly, and I want to go back to that decision made by the D.C. Appeals Court. In the decision, the judge specifically said, look, there's no competition. I understand this. I understand that the reason why we're trying to do this is because the market is not balancing itself out, because there is no other option for this traffic to flow. My question, and I'm going to throw this over to you, Dane, first, because I think, again, you may be able to provide us some unique insight on this, is why isn't there more competition? We've had the internet for coming on 2 decades now, and it would seem to me, with as popular as it's becoming, with as much money as there is to make there, we should have not just 1 or 2 big carriers, but dozens of them all vying for the best rates in a crowded market.
Yeah, if you get me started about competition, I can go on for an
Let's
hour.
Get you started.
So,
Dane, hit me.
Yeah, well, and it ties into your previous question about, is this a domestic question, and what does this mean internationally? And, when you look at Europe, which has a regulatory framework that looks a lot like the 1996 Telecommunications Act here, you have a lot of competitors to choose from. So you might in London or Paris have 30 or 40 different service providers to choose from. And so each of them collectively have less market power. So maybe neutrality is not as much an issue because the customer, the eyeball at the end, is sort of the captive audience. And if you have two service providers in a market, or even one in some markets domestically, versus Europe where you might have 30 or 40 to choose from, no one of those 30 or 40 wants to disadvantage traffic or charge extra for traffic because they don't have enough market power. Now, to answer your question about competition domestically and why don't we have any, it's an interesting situation, and I don't think it's entirely clear-cut. The generally accepted opinion is that we passed the Act in '96, and a lot of competitors arose subsequent to that, and they all went bankrupt in the early 2000s. And so there was something fundamentally flawed with the Act, and there were changes made during the Michael Powell era at the FCC, followed by Martin, to effectively cripple the Act a bit in order to discourage competition and to encourage investment by the entrenched incumbents. But I don't see a reason we shouldn't have more competitive access. And there should be 100 Sonic.nets scattered across the country serving regions like we do. There isn't a substantial regulatory barrier to that.
Yeah, Brandon, let me throw that over to you. Why don't we see 100 Sonic.nets? Why don't we see more companies challenging the incumbents? What is it about the Telecommunications Act that seems to have really stifled competition in this arena?
Yeah, so I think it's probably instructive to look back and see that it's effectively the same companies that resist net neutrality that also resisted the effort to make open access into homes and small businesses back in the late 90s and even the early 2000s. So it's the same entrenched interests that want to keep control of that whole part of the internet. So what I think would make the biggest difference was that the Telecom Act of 1996 missed the mark. We should have done something more like what Australia did, which was to take the last mile connectivity that actually goes into your homes, all that cabling, and put that in a separate entity, make that entity the common carrier, make that entity have to just provide the same services to any comer for the same rate without getting involved in the content part of that at all, because that's where the natural monopoly is. It's difficult to have 5 or 8 or 10 different cable and twisted pair connections into a home. Those networks are just too expensive to build. But if you separate those from the backbone network, from the content delivery, and from the content sourcing parts of the world, those parts could all compete with each other, while the last mile connectivity could be a little better regulated and concentrate on just providing that last mile connectivity. So I think that would have made a big difference here. I was involved in some of those efforts very early on, and they were working fine until the carriers managed to shut them down.
Oh, that's fascinating. Chibert, let me throw that over to you. What about that idea of saying, okay, there's that outer ring, there's the part of the network that touches the customers, the edge of the network, the absolute outer edge of that network. And yeah, okay, that's a lot of fiber, that's a lot of cable. It's very expensive to deploy that, and it's difficult to build a competition. But then why isn't there more in competition when we talk about the inner rings of that network? Why aren't there more CDNs that are competing for your business? Why aren't there more big pipes going across the country, Google notwithstanding, that can say, hey, look, if you want a better way to provide data to your customers, we're going to give it to you at a lower price?
Well, I think it's all about municipalities and rights of way. Remember Williams Communications way back in the 90s? They actually bought rights of ways following railroad tracks, and that's one of the reasons why they got eventually bought. Now, I want to directly answer the question about the Australian. The Australian carriers are going bankrupt. It sounds like a really good idea. It sounds like it should have worked, but they've blown so much money that they're closing up shop. They're selling off to various other corporations. One of the things that I learned before ThinLinks hacked me off was that there are huge data centers with massive pipes going into them that don't have any customers. So yeah, it sounds like a great idea, but I think there needs to be some more balance in there, because I don't think the Australian model is going to work either, considering how many of them are on the verge of bankruptcy.
You know, if only we had someone on the panel who actually has experience building out a network and having to deal with all the different rules and wait, we do. Dane, be my savior here. Tell me, what are the challenges to building out your own network? I mean, I think you could provide us that unique perspective as a man who has actually had to walk those fine lines between ticking off the incumbents and working with them and getting right-of-way. Why is it so difficult to get right-of-way? Why is it so difficult to deploy a network? Why is it so expensive to set up something that can compete with an AT&T or Verizon?
It's just ridiculously expensive. And, I think Brandon makes a good point. Perhaps the last mile is a natural monopoly. And, in the UK, where you have the OpenReach platform where they've separated BT into a last mile entity, which then sells services to internet service providers, or in Australia, where they've nationalized the network, buying it from the telecom and then running it as a sort of socialized network. That really runs counter to the sort of American premise of private property and capitalism, where we say, let the market decide. And, today we have a market that has effectively become a duopoly for a variety of reasons. And in some ways that's, a blessed duopoly created by the FCC. In other ways, it's the natural market forces. How many entities can lay new tracks to a given town in the railroad analogy, or in the fiber to the home? A third entrant might make sense. We're certainly pursuing that. Google and others are pursuing that. A fourth, a fifth. You're certainly not going to see, in my opinion, a fourth or fifth entrant serving that last mile, because it's very, very expensive. So, we don't see regulatory barriers. California has some challenges around the California Environmental Quality Act, so there's some hoops to jump through. But it can be accomplished from a regulatory perspective. It's primarily about uptake, market share, and penetration. So if you have two providers today, a cable provider and a telco provider, who roughly each have half of the market, and you want to build a new fiber network, how much of that market can you capture? And is that going to be enough to finance the construction of that network? And that's the big challenge. It's really just a financial challenge, not a regulatory or right-of-way issue, generally speaking.
Wow. Okay. I want to go a little deeper on that. Just again, because I think you can tell us a little bit about these insider secrets, the difficulty in actually bringing out a line to an area. I'm going to give you an example. I live in the Sunset in San Francisco, and I would love to get SonicNet because I'm stuck with. I don't want to embarrass the incumbent. I'll just say they're a three-letter company that looks like a Death Star. But this company provides horrible service. I'd love to get SonicNet out there. What would be the process by which Sonic.net would be able to say, okay, we're gonna get the rights of way. We're gonna bury a cable somewhere in the sunset so that we could deploy it to the neighborhood. What would you have to go through as the CEO of Sonic.net to make that happen?
Well, in the sunset today in San Francisco, we're delivering services on copper now. And actually to about 4 million homes in California, we're delivering next generation DSL and POTS voice services. So as a competitor, as a facilities-based competitor, delivering copper services is possible today. And if you've got DSL in the sunset, you could probably switch to Sonic.net and get faster service for less money. The bigger question, though, and the thing that people really want, is fiber to the home, and in particular, really fast fiber to the home. So to answer your question about that process, it's a process of engineering. So in the sunset, all of the electric and telecommunications distribution is on overhead poles, by and large. So you survey all those poles. You do loading calcs to determine, what the weight, angle, and moment is, and whether or not the pole is going to blow down, basically. And then you apply to attach, And in the case of San Francisco, if you'd like to put electronics in cabinets, you have to go through Department of Public Works to put those cabinets on the street. And so it's achievable, it can be accomplished. Roughly speaking, it's about $1,000 to $2,000 per home passed.
Per home.
Passed, not served. So the question then is,
wow,
what percentage of the market will you serve? And that really drives your cost per home connected.
So it's not $1,000 to get service out to a customer. It's $1,000 for every home you pass by, regardless of whether or not they're getting service from you.
Correct. So if you want to build a 1,000 home footprint, you're spending $1 million, and then the hope is that you can get a third of those customers, a half of those customers, and it's really, here at TWIT you think, well, everybody wants gigabit, everybody wants fiber to the home, but I'll say in the marketplace there's a lot of apathy. What they have is working, they're comfortable with it, they have a trusted brand despite their frustrations, and prying those customers off those products in a quantity large enough to fund the build out of a network like that is a real challenge.
Wow. Shebert, let me throw over to you, because that doesn't sound like it's unique. I'm thinking that math is probably pretty equal across the United States, at least the developed cities, where it costs a incredible amount of money just to lay your fiber down. I mean, if you're talking $1,000 per home passed, and maybe you get a customer for every 5 homes passed or something, $5,000 is not going to be something that you're going to recoup really, really quickly. That's enough to stifle competition entirely, right? I mean, if that's how much it costs, it surprises me that we've got any competitors whatsoever.
Oh, totally. Let's use an example. A particular community in West Oahu, their CIO decided, hey, we're going to be doing an awful lot of developing. We're going to be developing literally thousands of acres. Instead of just having water, gas, power as utilities, let's add another right of way, conduits in the ground, going to every household, every building, and let's go and make that a common carrier. But the problem they did was they started charging way, way too much money. Keep in mind, just, one of my favorite examples is if you are a wireless carrier and you want to go and rent space on a building, you not only have to pay for the lease line charges to get the data there, you also have to pay for floor space, square footage for your amplifiers and your radios. And that antenna on the roof typically is about $350 a month just for the freaking antenna. So you start adding all those numbers up of, what it costs to go and bring power to the pole, because it's now dedicated power only for you. You have to have separate metering, or you have to pay estimated metering. Then you have to pay for all the cable that you're running in. It starts adding up. So if you've ever, say you're a farm and you've ever had to buy a data link, you actually had to pay to get poles put in on your access road into your farm. And so, yeah, it's starting to get really, really tough. And, a lot of people don't want to pay that. Now, if all of a sudden it becomes part of the infrastructure and it's socialized access, then we might see something different. But are we going to socialize data? Heck, the United States, Obamacare is almost socialized medicine. Maybe we might want to think about socialized data. I don't know. Is it good? Is it bad? Sounds like a whole show of debate.
Well, and one of the challenges is that we have to work with what we have today. And if you were building a new city from the ground up today, if you went through the sort of development that an entity like Singapore went through over the last couple decades, you might do things quite differently. And, I'd love to see municipalities today pass regulations wherein developers need to place duct and fiber, and that fiber is administered by the municipality and treated in a neutral way. And that's something that's being done in some European countries where the municipality is funding the build out. Amsterdam is a good example. They're going back with public funds, building fiber to every premise, and actually building 3 or 4 strands of fiber to every premise that go back to neutral huts where multiple carriers can pay to interconnect. So, you know, if you were starting from a clean slate and if you could get enough momentum, there'd be some interesting opportunities in new development. But because it's gradual and organic, you have to work with what you have. And that means an overbuild. And that overbuild requires market share. And if you're going to be a third entrant, it's probably credible that over the long haul, you know, sort of 3 to 7 years, you might capture 1/3 of the market with a superior product. And so the question is, you know, can you build for that? At that cost, can you build to cover 1/3 of the market? And then will you see a fourth entrant? And when neutrality is a concern and when everyone needs to be facilities based all the way to the premise, the fourth entrant has to do the calculus and say, well, it's credible that I'm going to get 1/4 of the market, and a fifth entrant thinks they're going to get 20%. And at some point, you know, unless you have that sort of socialized last mile, you're going to have a neutrality problem. So that's really the crux of the issue.
Brandon, I want to go over to you because we've got a couple of really good questions in the chat room. One of them is from Toli, who said, wait a minute, why don't we just incentivize people, lay out $1 billion to make them roll out fiber? And then we've also got people who are saying, wait a minute, we've seen communities try to build their own community fiber projects. Those have all failed. We've actually incentivized quite a bit, and we still don't have the fiber build out that we thought we were going to have. And we've also seen communities try to build out their own fiber networks, and they've run into right-of-way issues. So tell me, do you think any of those, either incentivizing the incumbents to build out or just getting the local community to build out on their own, are those real solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we tried that, right? The stimulus funds of a couple of years ago, there was a huge amount of money went to mostly rural service providers to stimulate them to build out both some middle mile networks to carry, you know, backbone kind of traffic, but also at last mile. Several states actually have received funds. Well, not states, the individual entities within the states receive funds to cover all rural areas within their states, or at least large portions of them. And there's quite a bit of rural fiber now going to individual houses. Now, whether that is really the same thing as what we're talking about here is another question, right? Because the demand in those areas is much lower. But I don't think so. I tend to be pretty libertarian. I don't think government funding is necessarily the way to solve these problems. And I'm not necessarily suggesting, when I mentioned the Australian model, that the last mile should necessarily be owned by the government. There's no reason that you couldn't have a couple different last mile companies competing, right? We have legacy network connections into buildings today. Most places have two, right? A cable connection and a twisted pair connection. Some places have more, some have less. But for the most part, you could set up entities to own those things and call them common carriers, and they can still compete with each other for who can deliver the most bits to the end user most efficiently. Just the rule needs to be that they're not allowed to participate in content delivery or IP traffic peering and that kind of thing. But that's neither here than there. I also wanted to bring up the other end of the spectrum, kind of the devil's advocate position, which is that there are things that doing away with the requirement to have network neutrality actually helps out a lot in. Imagine an area that is underserved, whether that's in a city or rural area, doesn't matter. Imagine that those folks are financially disadvantaged and can't necessarily afford to pay for anything bigger than a 1 meg connection, just for sake of argument. Well, what if a company like Google came along and said, well, we're going to go ahead and provide up to 1 gigabit for every resident in this area as for them to connect to our services. So now you're not going the other way around. You're not saying, hey, I'm going to take your existing 10 or 100 meg network connection in the more developed areas and throttle down your Netflix and anything else that's competing with our natural video service. We're saying we're going to take and provide you services that you couldn't afford before. How does that start falling into the network neutrality thing? I would think that some provisions to provide extra services like that for free or at very low cost is actually a good thing.
Yeah. Let me go back to you, Dane, for one final round here. A good question asked in the chat room by Max1234. He said, look, as a basic business question would be, how do I make this cheaper? If I was building out a carrier, if I was building out a competitive service to what the incumbents have, how do I make it cheaper? How do I make it cheaper for me to deploy? How do I make it cheaper for my customers? What do I have to change to make this a competitive business proposal?
Well, that's a good question, Max 1234. There are some components of it that are difficult to make much of a dent in. So, labor costs and engineering are unavoidable. I think one area where there's some opportunity for innovation is sort of Kickstarter-style demand aggregation. A primary issue is, can you get enough customers to build and pay for the network? And one thing that you could do is commit to building the network within a certain geography if a certain percentage of people sign on or pre-sign on. And Google has dabbled in that in Kansas City. One other challenge is that the poles that one is attaching to, and we talked before a little bit about ownership of poles, that varies, but generally speaking, the communications space on the pole, that is the lower half of the pole, is generally owned and controlled by the incumbent telecom. And the cable operator then pays to attach to that, and a third entrant would pay to attach to that. And those applications have to be processed and vetted by the competitor, the incumbent telecom. So there's some opportunities for some streamlining there. The FCC has streamlined a lot of that over the last 3 years or so, but some states domestically have engaged in what's called reverse preemption, where the state regulates it instead of the Fed. California is one example of reverse preempted state. California had better standards than the Fed for some time. Now the federal standard is better than California's standard. And in the case of New Hampshire and Maine, the local regulator has come up with newer, better standards where a new entrant could attach below other incumbents, and attaching below everything that's already there is less costly. So there's definitely some regulatory streamlining that could be done, but fundamentally, whether you can get your cost per home pass to 1,000 or to 500 or 600 or 400, unless you can get a large percentage of consumers to take an interest in the product and commit to it, you're stuck.
You're stuck. All right, last call. I want to do one last question for each one of you. Cheebert, the question for you is going to be this. Is the answer for the FCC just to call them a common carrier now? I mean, that was one of the things that was left open in the decision, which is under the current classification as an information service, you don't have the right to regulate them. But if you reclassify ISPs as a telco, you do. Is that the next move? Is that what we expect to see from the FCC? Will they just say you are a common carrier?
Actually, I think the next move is actually creating a new class of common carrier and put some advantages in there on how they can operate and so forth. I think that's the next move. But more importantly, I think one of the things we might want to seriously consider was actually a joke that I saw on Facebook recently about how politicians should be drafted, just like the Army. And personally, I think that's not a bad idea, because it's really and truly career politicians that are looking out for their best interest and their supporters that is painting the United States into a corner. I think we need people that are in an office for maybe 1, 2, 3, or 4 years, depending on the technicality. And I think it needs to be drafted so that we have people wanting to get the heck out of office and make the world a better place. It's very idealistic. It's never going to happen. I'm probably going to have black helicopters over my home any second now, but I think, it's something to dream about.
By the way, the Jesuits control all the black helicopters in the world, so trust me, we're not heading out that way. Brandon, your last question actually comes to us from the chat room from Toli, who wants to go the other way. Says, wait a minute, what if we say no regulation? What if we let the telcos do what they're going to do without any fear of being regulated, without any fear of being classified as a common carrier, and the market will decide? Is that the way?
Well, I trust me, I tend to lean towards your direction totally. I would always prefer to see less regulation than more regulation. I think the reality of the problem, though, is that is still that natural monopoly in that last mile. It's just, as Dane said, it's just so expensive to build out alternatives there that my fear would be that in most places in the United States, your only choices are going to be the incumbent telephone company and the incumbent cable company, and that's it. sure, in some dense city areas, and even in some rural areas, you might have some wireless carriers and stuff like that. But I just don't think you're going to see a ton of last mile construction just because those costs are just so high. But I think it's worthy of experimentation. I think municipalities and states should definitely be allowed to experiment on their own with those rules and see what happens. Certainly things in places like Kansas City with Google, like Dane mentioned, the Google Fiber project, I think that's going to teach us a lot about what might happen if overbuilders do show up and do a very good job of building out a very high quality network.
Dane, I'm going to give you the visionary seat. What do you want to see? Maybe not what will we see, but what do you want to see out of competition, out of an increase of internet broadband services in the next 3 years?
Well, domestically, it's really clear that we need more competitors. And, I'd like to see regional operators like Sonic.net in California spring up all around the country. And that's certainly feasible with the Telecommunications Act as it sits today. I think it's also important that municipalities and states continue to move towards making the process easier rather than harder. And, for aerial construction, generally speaking, the poles are in place and the municipalities don't have a lot of say, which means they don't have a lot of opportunity to slow or accelerate the process. But for communities that are served with buried utilities, the city is intimately involved in that underground construction. And so cities have an opportunity to ease that process. And, we've seen examples where we're engaged in underground construction in one city and the permit fees are completely manageable and the inspection process is prompt and the city clearly wants to work with us. And in a nearby city, we're going to be doing directional drilling and they'd like us to have an arborist standing by when we go underneath every tree, which, when you're drilling a small hole is really not a practical issue. In other words, the inspectors are going to be standing there, the arborists are going to be standing there. They really want to engage in a process which is more challenging. So municipalities have an opportunity to, instead of rolling out the red tape, kind of roll out the red carpet and attempt to make the process easier. And that's, I think, a story that the Fiber to the Home Council has been telling, a story that Google has been telling, and we're seeing municipalities, like Austin and like Kansas City, Kansas, and Missouri, taking up that challenge and trying to catalyze that overbuild. Because without an overbuild, you're going to have this slow evolution of a competitive marketplace where you have a duopoly kind of slowly one-upping the other side, and that's really not adequate.
I like that. Good words. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, but you've used up another hour listening to the best dang podcast in the universe. That's according to a survey of 9 out of 10 nuns. Now, I do want to thank my panelists. You guys just made this absolutely wonderful to do. Let me start with you, Brian. Brian, what should the Twilight Right know about you, about what you're working on, about what you're up to?
Well, I actually had a conversation with a principal investigator at the University of Hawaii recently, and he went off on a rant on how much less secure clouds are. And it made me really realize I need to dedicate an entire chapter in my cloud security book on why that just isn't so. It is basically FUD. When you have a cloud, you have more opportunities to examine the data going in and out. And most importantly, as Michael Wild mentioned to me the other day, was when you have a cloud, that means you also more than likely don't have an idiot with an infected laptop plugging in on the same network as your servers. So I think I'm going to need to go and write yet another chapter on just FUD.
Yeah, we're going to have to, we'll all have to read that book, or maybe have a book on tape when it comes out. Now, over to you, Brandon. Thank you for coming over again. I'll see you in a couple of weeks at the Interrupt Pod stage, but it is always a pleasure to work with you. Tell the Twilight Riot where they can find you, about what you're working on, and a little bit about your company.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure, Padre. You know, my company, Network Utility Force, provides network architecture and design services for service providers and enterprise as well. And I was actually just thinking as we were talking through here that one of the complaints about the network neutrality part was that some very large carriers said that they were having problems managing their networks because of all of the traffic. Well, I'm sure I can help them with that. If they'd like to come and hire us, we would be happy to provide them some consulting services to teach them how to manage their networks despite the large amount of traffic that the lack or that the enforcement of network neutrality apparently was causing them. But anyway, you can find us on the web at www.netuf.net. Feel free to email us at any time. Some links up there and some profiles of the folks that we work with to help provide engineering services.
And Dane Jasper, CEO, co-founder of Sonic.net, thank you for driving up from San Francisco, for being with us, for giving us some really good insight. I mean, you've actually had to build out these networks. You've had to work with these regulations. And so your contribution is absolutely invaluable. What would you like the Twite Right to know about? Where can they find Sonic.net? Where can they find your services? Where do they find you?
Oh, I didn't know we get to put in a plug.
Yes.
I appreciate that. So Sonic.net is a regional service provider serving the Los Angeles area, Sacramento, and the greater Bay Area. And we're using that platform to aggregate demand. And as communities reach higher thresholds, we're building fiber to the home and fiber to the business. So certainly, you know, whenever you're moving, whenever you're setting up your business, today in California, we certainly appreciate if folks take a look at Sonic.net and check for service availability. We've been awarded top honors by the EFF around customer privacy. We obviously run a neutral network, despite the law of the land today. And we're one of the few service providers that are building out gigabit fiber networks and delivering services at that rate of speed.
Brian, Dane, Brandon, thank you so very, very much. And thanks to you, our loyal listener or watcher. Without you, we wouldn't have a show. We wouldn't be able to bring you the best dang enterprise podcast in the universe. And so we want to do something for you. What we'd like to do is to give you a page, say at twit.tv/Twite, where you could find all of our episodes and get them automatically downloaded to the device of choice. If you want it on your iPhone, of course, we've got an option for that. How about your iPad? Duh. What about your Android tablet, phone, device, Zune, laptop, desktop, whatever it may be? Absolutely. Just find the version that works for you, and each and every single week, you'll get some enterprise goodness in your inbox. Also, did you know that you can find us on YouTube? Yeah, we actually have a YouTube channel. Go to youtube.com/Twite, and not only will you be able to find all of our episodes, but you'll be able to hear when we have upcoming events, when we're going to be doing hangouts, and when we're going to be doing things like Interop. It's all fun and games until someone gets a knock. Also, you can find me on my Twitter page. Go ahead and follow me at twitter.com/PadreSJ. You'll be able to see what I do in between shows. You'll be able to see the other shows that I do on the Twit TV network, and you'll be able to say hi. Trust me, I'll say hi back. Finally, did you know that we do this show live every week? That's right, here, Mondays, 2:30 p.m. Pacific time. And as long as you're watching live, which means you'll be able to see us set up and tear down, you'll be able to watch all the bloopers that don't go into the final mix, but you'll also be able to be part of our chat room, the smartest group of people on the interwebs. Go to irc.twit.tv and you'll be able to talk to me during the show. You've probably heard me call out questions from the chat room. That's just because it's filled with some of the brightest people, some of the funniest trolls, and yes, some true visionary Twit Army soldiers. I'm Father Robert Ballester here at the Twit TV studios, and I just want to remind you, if you want to know what's going on in the enterprise, just keep Twite.